now, the sunchoke or the Jerusalem artichoke, was domesticated at this time 6,000 years ago. They also developed highly complex trading cultures where there was confederacies and alliances that stretched for thousands of miles. We have evidence, at least in eastern New York in the Hudson River Valley, there's evidence of materials that there were projectile points for spears and javelins that could only have come from Ohio, 500 miles away. And in Minnesota, there's records of cacao beans, chocolate cacao beans that could only have come from Central America through these overland trading routes. So the degree of sophistication in the trade and the culture and the civilizations that built up were incredible. And some people will say that what the native peoples were doing at that time were primitive skills. But if you've ever tried to actually weave a basket that could hold water, which they did, or make a clay pot, or chip away at a piece of stone until it becomes a knife or an arrowhead, these things are incredibly difficult to do. They're way, way more sophisticated than we are now. It was around this time, 6,000 years ago, that the native people began to develop a new management technique where they began to manage the entire landscape as an agricultural ecosystem. In short, they began to burn the forests. So once again, fire enters into the picture of this place. The earliest colonial records, thousands of years later, said that the forest here had enormous, enormous trees. 7 trees to the acre on average. Big, huge trees, and underneath them it wasn't thick with brush. It was totally open. There was a grassy plain. The berries grew up. The game was incredibly abundant. That's because fire kills off all the understory. The trees that survive are the thick-barked trees, like oak, like American chestnut, like hickory, that can withstand the fires. Some of the other trees died out. It also created this black charcoal, biochar, across the entire forest floor. And there's been some evidence that links they're beginning to burn the whole forest to changes in water pH that allowed the mass migrations of anadromous fish to come up the rivers. The shad, the sturgeon that used to come up the rivers to spawn and then come back down has been linked to large-scale burning of the landscape. What it looked like in that area was probably something like this. This open understory grassland, maybe with the buffaloes grazing. Hugely abundant in terms of the nuts that would fall from the trees, the berries that grew from the ground, and the wild game that traveled through. Thousands of years later, a people called the Lenape people came from somewhere further west, we don't know exactly where, and first made it to what we now call the Delaware River Valley, and then came further into what's now the Hudson River Valley, and came even further again to this part of the world, to Connecticut. We'll pause a minute for folks to get seated.
Thank you, so sorry.
No worries, welcome.
Here it is. It's the pen.
So the Lenape are considered the grandfathers of all of the Algonquin tribes. The Algonquin tribes stretched from basically from here and a little further west, what's now the border with New York, all the way up the east and up the east coast and up towards Maine. The tribes that were specifically right here in New Haven and up where Bethany is were called the Wangunk. The Wangunk were the ones who were right there, and there was also a tribe called the Paugussett or Paugasset that lived in that area. But we think we've pretty well clarified that in Bethany itself it was the Wangunk people. There's very, very little information about them specifically. So what we have comes from our understanding of the Algonquin peoples. Everything we've learned seemed like food and enjoyment and craft was just abundant. The survival was not the primary goal. People at this time, it's been estimated that they were working between 4 and 8 hours per week to meet all of their basic needs. 4 and 8 hours per week. How many folks are working 4 to 8 hours per week now? Okay. They would do things like make these giant canoes, either out of birch bark or out of long, hollowed-out logs. They could fit 20 or 30 people in these canoes. These pictures are a bit fanciful from colonial times, but actually some things are relatively accurate based on what we've learned. The women would wear tanned hides, white, beautiful tanned buckskin hides, and the men apparently in this area did wear their hair in all sorts of beautiful, wild ways. The native people in general, when Europeans arrived thousands of years later, were very confused by these small, because Europeans are relatively small compared to the tall peoples who are here, small, bearded, hairy, stinky, because they had just been on the boats for a long time and they didn't have nearly the hygiene that the native peoples here did, who were bathing every day and covering themselves with scented oils. Also, many of the Europeans were deformed from polio and all the other diseases that they had over in Europe from thousands of years of co-domestication with animals. So the native people thought it was very funny when these small, white-skinned, bearded, stinky apes showed up from the other side and began, taking over the landscape. At first, the native people were completely happy to share. They had a different concept of land ownership. There wasn't land ownership. If anything, the land owned them. So when these English settlers and Dutch settlers said, we want to live here and be sharing in these goods, they said, great, come and share. There's such abundance. They were eating at that time the shad, this abundant fish that runs up the rivers. There's also sturgeon and Atlantic salmon. This is an image of some of the traditional ways of baking the shad fish, which is laid out on boards and put into the fire. This is a traditional shad bake. It was also around this time that more crops began to be domesticated. Things like maize or corn, things like annual beans, squashes, other types of greens were created at that time. And so, beautiful diversity of corn. There was a famous dish that was eaten by the Algonquin Indians in this area that was called Succotash. And succotash was a mixture of corn and beans cooked in a big earthen pot. Sometimes they would add fresh or dried fish for flavor. To thicken it, they would crush up chestnuts or hickories or walnuts and add that to the stew. They would take their corn, wrap it in leaves, and cook it in the ashes of the fire and eat it alongside strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, and the maple syrup from the maple trees that they tapped. So food was abundant and delicious. They had a highly egalitarian society, complete equality between men and women, respect for elders and young ones. They lived multi-generationally in a way that we probably can't even conceive of now. These peoples, upon the time of European contact, a bit hard to read this map, but it basically shows the different tribes that were living in the state of Connecticut. Here's New Haven. Here it says, here is more or less where Bethany is, spread out across the entire landscape. But it wasn't long before the things that the Europeans brought with them began to devastate the culture and the peoples who are here. Disease was rampant. There was something like 27 different diseases that Europeans carried over with them from Europe that the native peoples here just simply had no immune systems built up to. Smallpox, polio, rampant. Some records in the 1630s say that 90% of many of the villages were just dead from smallpox outbreaks. There was one disease that was a pathogenic disease that was here in North America that traveled back over to Europe. Anyone know what that was? Syphilis. And wreaked havoc over there. Just to get a sense of how much one disease that was prevalent here wreaked havoc in Europe, and to get the sense of 27 times that coming. So many times the English would basically outright steal land. Maybe there was some exchange, but the understanding of the native peoples who were here was just very different than the Europeans for ownership of land. And there were some very oppressive and unfair policies that got passed over the years. There was a war called the Pequot War in 1638, culminating in the Pequot Massacre, where 600 or 700 at Mystic Island, where 600 or 700 men, women, and children were burned alive. There was closer to this way in 1675. There was another war, whose name? King Philip's War. King Philip's War, Metacomet, which the ridge is named after, was more intense here. At that time, basically the entire state of Connecticut went under martial law. Any native person carrying any weapons at all, there was a law by the General Council that said if you see them and they don't immediately put down their weapons and say, I'm a friend, you can shoot them. And then you're completely in your right to kill them, just on sight. So it was a pretty intense, oppressive time. And it wasn't long before the native peoples began to mostly disappear. They got put on reservations and moved from here to there. And most native peoples are still here, existing today. Very, very few of them actually went extinct. But their reservations are tiny. There's a quarter-acre, half-acre reservation not far from here at Golden Hill that people keep trying to take even more pieces away from.